This week's lesson is entitled Miracles Around the Lake. And as such, we're going to take a look at the miracles that once again demonstrate that Jesus is indeed God. Our memory text for this week, and it comes from Mark 5:19. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you." When I was a child growing up back home in Newfoundland, there was a television show that would air on Sunday evenings. It was called Land and Sea. And it was a show that featured, stories of people who survived by living off the land or the sea. Now, this week's lesson could have been called Land and Sea, as it features stories about Jesus and the miracles he performed both on the land and the miracles he performed out on the sea. From casting out demons, healing the sick, raising the dead, feeding the 5,000 on land, to calming the raging storms and walking on water. We, like the disciples, will be drawn to this one conclusion: Jesus is indeed the Son of God. Now we come to Sunday's lesson, and we get to see that Jesus was indeed both fully human and fully God. After a long day of preaching and performing miracles, Jesus is what we would call, exhausted. I would imagine that he is mentally, emotionally, and physically exhausted. Think about this. How tired do you have to be to fall asleep in a crowded boat and nothing can wake you up, not even a storm? I think that something we all too easily forget is just how human Jesus really was. And by the way, just for the record, there's no sin in being tired or being so tired that you need to rest. It's actually a sin to not rest when your mind and body need to rest. So, there's Jesus. He's fast asleep in the back of the boat, and one of those famous Sea of Galilee storms blew in. They say that from time to time, these storms can easily sink a boat, and apparently it threatened to do so that night. So, what do the disciples do? They wake Jesus up. Jesus takes a look at the storm, the waves pouring over the sides into the boat, and he asks, "Why are you so afraid?" Then he turns to the storm and he commands it to stop. And the storm, it obeys its master's voice. And it leads the disciples to ask the most important question they can ask. Who is this Jesus? It's a great question, and we're going to explore it more later on this week. I don't know about you, but there's something about graveyards that I find unnerving, especially at night. Now, let me be clear. I know for an absolute certainty that the people who are at rest in the graveyard are in fact at rest. There are no ghosts or spirits floating around in a graveyard. The Bible is clear. When you die, you are dead and you are gone. And yet there's something about a graveyard that puts us off. Now imagine one night you're walking past a graveyard and you start to hear screams coming from among, the tombstones. And if that isn't bad enough, if you look hard enough, there, off in the shadows, is a madman running around cutting himself with stones. I don't care what your theology is, that will unnerve the best of us. So, I want you to imagine the scene. You know the man who lives in the graveyard, or at least you've heard the stories. He's strong and he's dangerous because what you've heard is that the man, he's demon-possessed. He's so strong that with Samson-like strength, this guy can break chains and shatter shackles. There's no holding this guy back. And when he yells at you, this is not his voice you hear, but it's the voice of a demon. This is the stuff of nightmares. And this guy, he's living it. Now get this. To the best of our knowledge, this man has never seen Jesus before. And yet the moment he sees Jesus, he runs towards him. And instead of attacking Jesus, he falls at Jesus' feet like a person would do when they want to worship. Those words fell down in the Greek actually translate to worship. Despite his spiritual condition, this man was able to recognize his need for Jesus to save him and Jesus' ability to save him. And Jesus does what nobody else could do. He didn't subdue the man. He subdued the demons within the man. What chains could not restrain, Jesus does so by his very presence. The demons know exactly who Jesus is and what he can do to them. So they make a request. Send us into the pigs. Now think about this. The demons thought that possessing a pig was better than the alternative. We don't know what that alternative is, but apparently it's worse than living in a pig. In this story, we see the great controversy being played out. And at the heart of this war is the revelation of two very different kingdoms. Notice that in this story, the kingdom of Satan enslaved a man and led him to a place not of the living, but the dead. There can be no better symbol of Satan's kingdom than that of a graveyard, because in the end, all who follow Satan will die. Now contrast that with Jesus, who set a man free and then restored him to the land of the living. There is no greater symbol for the kingdom of Jesus Christ than the freedom that comes that gives us life. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm in a crowd, I try to do my best not to bump into people. And I'm fairly certain that you try not to bump into people as well. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you can't help bump into the people around you. Now imagine you're in a situation where a lot of people try to bump into you, or they're trying to touch you. How in the world would you know which person touched you, and why would you ask, who touched me? If everybody, in fact, is trying to touch you. I think today's Sabbath school lesson reminds us that there were things that touched Jesus in such a way that it moved him to perform miracles. For example, a very religious man by the name of Jairus is on his knees asking for help. We know that Jairus was no ordinary Jew. He was a ruler in the synagogue, and typically people came to him asking for his help. But today, he's not a ruler. He's a father. And out of desperation, he is begging Jesus not to help Jairus, but to help his daughter. And Jesus is touched by this man's love for his daughter. You know the story. On the way to Jairus' house, Jesus was touched in a very different way by a woman who was also desperate. Only this time, her desperation wasn't for a loved one. It was for herself. For 12 years, she had what the Bible called, an issue of blood, which meant that, according to the law, she was not allowed, to be out in public. According to the law, when a person was bleeding, they were unclean. This meant they could not be with other people until the bleeding was stopped and the proper cleaning rituals were enacted. Her bleeding never stopped. Imagine the risk she was taking by going out in public. All she had to do was touch the wrong religious person, and she could be stoned. And who does she set her eyes on? But a prophet. The risk was huge. If Jesus turned out to be like the other religious leaders of her day, she could die just for attempting to touch Jesus. And touch Jesus, she did. But what moved Jesus wasn't that she physically touched him. What moved Jesus was the same thing that moved Jesus when Jairus came to him. What touched him was their faith. The woman is healed, but in the time it took for Jesus to minister to her and to confirm her faith, a little girl dies. I can't even imagine how devastated Jairus must have been when he received the news that his daughter had died, that she died because Jesus stopped to heal a woman who had no business being out in public. But instead of blaming the woman, Jairus did something that touched Jesus even more. In his grief and pain, he still chose to put his faith in Jesus. And in turn, Jesus' touch would raise the dead. And the question everybody asked was becoming much more clearer. Who is this man? We have a saying here in North America that goes something like this. It was handed to them on a silver platter. Now, when we say it that way, what we mean is that somebody has some special talent or ability that they didn't have to work very hard, to develop. It just came to them naturally. Now, sometimes we will also say something like, if my parents find out that I disobeyed them, then they will have my head on a silver platter. I don't think that John the Baptist would appreciate the fact that the manner of his death would produce, well, such a saying. But the truth of the matter is, having your head or anything else served up on a silver platter comes from the story of John the Baptist. But today's lesson doesn't start out with John. It starts with Jesus. Now, imagine Jesus' surprise when he returns home to Nazareth for a visit. And not only does his former friends and neighbors reject him, but his family has issues with him as well. Apparently, Jesus knew firsthand what it meant for a prophet not to be accepted in their own hometown. Now compare that with John, who had rejection issues of his own. It would seem that preaching the truth among a people who claim to have the truth could get you killed. I think this is what Paul was talking about in Romans chapter 1 when he said in verse 18, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." In other words, there are people who know the truth, but they refuse to live it, and they do their best to keep others from living it as well. This described not only the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but it also applied to King Herod as well. When Herod hears the truth, what does he do? He throws in jail the one who is speaking the truth. But no matter how hard they try, they can't keep the truth from being preached. As the voice of the one crying in the wilderness is silenced, 12 more pop up to replace it. Only this time, the message of repentance for a time would spread from city to city and town to town like wildfire. While Jesus and John are facing rejection, the message of the kingdom is being preached. And the greatest miracle of all would take place. People were being saved. Now, I don't know about you, but from time to time, I've been to potlucks and banquets where there was a lot of food. As a matter of fact, there was so much food, people were begging each other to take stuff home. And then there were times, I've been to a potluck or to a banquet, and I remember the kitchen staff praying what I imagine to be a prayer similar to that of Jesus. "Please, Lord, multiply the food so that there is enough for everyone." I think we've all been there from time to time. I imagine that's what it was like the day Jesus turned to the disciples and he said, "I want to make sure these people have a bite to eat before they go home." Now, the disciples open their wallets and they empty their pockets. And they know that they don't have enough money to buy food for what we think could have been 20,000 or more people that day. Now, I don't know about you, but I think sometimes we come down too hard on the disciples. They are simply looking at the situation and they know that they do not have the resources to do what Jesus is asking them to do. And Jesus knows that they don't have the resources either. And I think this is exactly the lesson Jesus had in mind for his disciples and for us today. When God asks us to do something, he's not asking us to depend on our resources, but his. All they had was 5 loaves of bread and a couple of small fish. What Jesus had was a father who just happens to own a heavenly bakery and a fish market that never runs out. So much so that by the time Jesus fills their baskets, they still had 12 baskets of bread and fish left over. You know, something to take with you on the way home. Now, when the people saw this, they started to connect the dots. First of all, this is a miracle. And secondly, only the Messiah could perform such a miracle. And then this Messiah could easily feed an army and maybe the entire nation. If Jesus had given the order, some, if not all of those people would have gone to Rome, war with Rome that day. But imagine their surprise when Jesus refused to lead such a revolt, but instead he sends them home. Why? Because they still had to learn who this man was. Yes, he was the Messiah, but instead of taking lives in a revolt, he came to give his life as a ransom for many, a lesson they were not yet willing to learn.